The account books that fed an empire. The boring world of medieval grain clerks. It always begins with the ledger. Not a sword, not a crown, not a banner fluttering in the wind, but a quiet ledger. A bound volume, its pages soft from the oils of 1,000 fingers, its corners curled from damp air and long use. Ink, brown with age. Columns, figures, tally marks. The dates stretch out like footsteps across the page, each one marking a delivery of grain, a missed shipment, a calculation corrected with a tiny smudge of sanded parchment. In medieval times, before the age of bureaucrats in suits or logistics algorithms humming in distant server farms, there was a quieter kind of management, handled not by kings or generals, but by clerks, specifically grain clerks, men, and in rare, often unrecognized cases, women, who spent their lives bent over wooden desks, recording how much barley had come in, where the rye had gone, and whether the miller in the next village had shorted his sack by a handful of oats. It might sound unbearably dull, and perhaps it was, but if you lived in a kingdom like England in the 13th century, or in the Holy Roman Empire, or the fat, fertile river valleys of France, you lived by the grain. Bread was not merely a food, it was the food. Most people, particularly the poor, consumed it at nearly every meal, and behind every loaf, every dry crust gnawed beside a hearth fire, there was a paper trail. Grain moved across the countryside, like blood through veins. It had to be counted, stored, taxed, measured, and reported. Someone had to do that. And so there were clerks. The role of the grain clerk wasn't glamorous. In fact, it was the opposite of glamorous. It was work that required patience, attention to detail, and above all, endurance, mental and physical. Clerks worked by natural light, in chill stone buildings or cramped wooden annexes built onto grain barns and toll houses. Their ink was thick and prone to freezing in winter. Their pens were made of quills that had to be trimmed and sharpened by hand. The hours were long, the tools basic. Their mistakes could lead to bread shortages, riots, or even war. They weren't paid much, and they rarely received recognition. But without them, the grain system collapsed. An empire might survive a battle, but a winter without bread could bring down a king. In medieval England, the position was often called the granator, or custos granari. In Latin-speaking regions of Europe, one might see them listed in manorial records as clericus frumenti, literally the grain clerk. In the Holy Roman Empire, they went by various local terms depending on dialect. Some were monks, managing the stores of abbeys. Others were laymen appointed by local lords, acting as stewards or administrators. Regardless of title, the job was fundamentally the same: to ensure that the lifeblood of the village, grain, was tracked, tallied, and safely stored. It is easy to overlook the weight of what they recorded. A clerk might begin his day by recording the arrival of carts from neighboring fields. Oxen creaked under the strain of harvested wheat. The sacks were weighed, recorded, and entered into the storage bins. The grain was often measured using a standard vessel, a wooden bushel that was supposed to be uniform across the realm, but everyone knew each estate's bushel was just slightly different, its round belly a little fuller or thinner than others. Clerks knew this. They wrote it down. Once the grain was received, it was divided, some to the Lord's stores, some to the miller, some for seed, some for tithes. If the grain was taxed, say during a time of royal levy, the clerk had to separate what was owed to the crown and arrange its transport, often under guard. Every transfer required documentation, often in triplicate. Wax seals, tallies, ledgers was a rhythm, a slow one. But over the months and seasons, it built into something massive. Grain clerks didn't only track harvests, they also monitored decay. One of the least appreciated but most essential parts of the job was understanding rot. Grain, for all its value, was a living thing. It could spoil, it could attract rats, or go musty with moisture. A misjudged storage bin could lead to an infestation that destroyed months of work. So, clerks learned to inspect grain for signs of damage, color, scent, the presence of beetles. They had crude but clever tools, long grain spears to probe into deep sacks and bins, sieves to check for contaminants, even teeth used to test kernels by bite. They recorded everything. If a store had gone bad, it was logged and sometimes blamed on a particular steward or laborer. Accusations might follow. A ruined store could be the difference between a calm spring and a hungry revolt. As such, clerks became cautious, perhaps even paranoid. They developed systems to double and triple check measurements. One famous manorial record from northern France in 1278 shows a steward insisting that the same cartload of barley be measured by volume and by weight, then cross-checked against prior year's entries for irregularities. It delayed things terribly, but no one went hungry that year. Clerks were also early economists in their way. They tracked supply and demand with obsessive detail. They noticed when barley prices went up after a poor harvest in a neighboring village. They anticipated shortages and sometimes advised their lords on how much to sell or not sell. They understood local weather patterns. If rain had come too early, they knew the wheat would be stunted and prices would rise. In drought years, they made grim calculations. How much seed could be spared from the storehouse without risking famine? It's easy to forget that before maps and spreadsheets and supply chain logistics, these records were the map. A clerk with 20 years of records could spot patterns, a cycle of abundance and scarcity, of war and quiet. Their handwriting, often cramped and cramped further still to save space on parchment, tracked the pulse of the land, and their offices, such as they were tucked away in unlikely corners. One clerk in a Yorkshire manor house was said to have worked in a room converted from a former storeroom for beer. The scent of malt hung in the air, even as he calculated grain totals by candlelight. But clerks weren't just observers. They were sometimes managers of consequence. In larger estates, they directed teams of labourers, overseers, and guards. They ordered when and where grain was to be moved, how it would be protected in transport, and which bins were to be opened first. A clever clerk could even shift a small economy. Take the case of William the Counter from Ely, a grain steward. In the mid-1200s, William noticed that storing grain in elevated wooden bins, rather than earthen pits, reduced spoilage. He quietly implemented this change across several manors under his charge. The yields remained the same, but losses dropped dramatically. The result? His lord made more profit, the villagers had more consistent bread, and the practice eventually spread to nearby estates. William's records survive, barely, a few folios, stained with what might be candle soot or ale, but they contain notations like wheat drier here than yonder in clay store. Bins hold better. A fragment, yes, but also a sign of real-world experimentation and its effect on food systems. There were darker sides to the role as well. Clerks sometimes acted as enforcers. When tithes were not paid, or when villagers hoarded grain, it was the clerk who reported it. In famine years, that might mean the difference between leniency and punishment. Some clerks, especially those serving monasteries, tried to balance mercy and obligation. Others sided more firmly with authority. In France, in the years leading up to the Great Famine of 1315-1317, records show a dramatic rise in clerical complaints about hidden stores and refused grain. Desperate villagers were trying to hold on to what little they had. Some clerks ignored it. Others informed the reeve or bailiff. Punishments ranged from fines to seizure of goods. A few records even suggest imprisonment. The grain clerk, so seemingly peripheral, was in truth close to the moral center of the village, deciding, often silently, whether to look the other way or to record the truth. The sustenance that carried messages across the steppe. In the vast and ever-shifting landscapes of the Mongol Empire, survival depended on more than swift horses and well-worn roads. Behind every message carried from one end of the empire to another lay a delicate balance of food, endurance, and human will. This balance was maintained quietly by the postal workers themselves, riders, grooms, cooks, and support staff, who lived and breathed the rhythms of the land and their cargo. While the world often remembers Mongol horsemen for their speed and military prowess, fewer pause to consider what they ate along the way, how they carried themselves through harsh winters, scorching summers, and endless grasslands stretching beyond the horizon. The Mongol postal system, known as the Yam, was a sprawling network of relay stations, each stocked with fresh horses, supplies, and crucially, food. At first glance, this might seem a simple logistic detail, but the story of Mongol postal provisions reveals a complex web of survival strategies, cultural practices, and clever adaptations to the environment. The daily diet of a Mongol postal worker was dictated by necessity and availability, shaped by the demands of endurance and the harsh steppe environment. Unlike settled agricultural societies, where stores of grain and vegetables could be stockpiled, the nomadic Mongols relied heavily on animal products, meat, milk, and dried foods that could be preserved and transported easily. A typical meal for a rider might consist of airag, fermented mare's milk, dried or fresh mutton, and kurut, which are small dried balls made from sour milk. These were practical choices, lightweight, calorie-dense, and capable of lasting long journeys without spoiling. The fermented mare's milk, a staple of Mongol life, was more than just nutrition. It carried cultural significance, was mildly alcoholic, and helped to stave off dehydration. Riders often carried dried meat strips called borts, which were lean and could be quickly eaten on the move. At each yam or relay station, postal workers found a brief respite from their grueling rides. These stations, spaced roughly every 25 to 40 miles, were not just places to exchange horses, but small hubs of sustenance and rest. Behind the scenes, cooks and stable hands prepared simple but nourishing meals to rejuvenate the riders before they set off again into the vast expanse of the steppe. Food preparation here was minimalist but efficient. Meat would be boiled over small fires, often with dried herbs or wild onions, creating a broth that replenished both body and spirit. Dairy products were served fresh when available, and fresh water was drawn from wells or nearby streams. Despite the simplicity, these meals were vital. They provided much-needed calories and hydration, crucial for riders who would soon cover dozens of miles in the biting cold or scorching heat. The yam staff often worked in near silence, understanding the importance of quiet restoration. The Mongol Empire's incredible communication speed, sometimes up to 200 miles a day, owed much to the riders' stamina, but also to the smart ways they managed their food and energy. Long before modern sports drinks or energy bars, these postal workers depended on the natural, nutrient-rich foods of the steppe. In addition to dried meat and fermented milk, riders sometimes carried arrowroot-like tubers and wild herbs, which provided essential vitamins and minerals. These natural supplements helped stave off scurvy and fatigue during extended campaigns or harsh weather conditions. Furthermore, the relay system itself was designed to minimize exhaustion. Riders switched horses at each station, ensuring fresh mounts, but also used food to maintain their own energy reserves. The yam also employed cooks who traveled with key couriers during longer journeys, preparing hot meals at strategic points. Even with careful planning, Mongol postal workers faced immense challenges that threatened their food supply and survival. Harsh winters brought deep snow and frozen rivers, making travel slow and dangerous. During these times, forage for horses was scarce, and finding fresh meat or milk became nearly impossible. Famine or localized food shortages sometimes struck, especially during prolonged military campaigns or years of drought. When the yam's supply chain faltered, riders had to rely on their ingenuity, hunting game, gathering wild plants, or rationing dried foods carefully. In some cases, messages were delayed as riders slowed their pace to conserve energy. The resilience of the postal system lay not just in horses or roads, but in these human adaptations to unpredictable conditions. Couriers learned to read the land, recognize edible plants, and carry emergency rations in clever, space-saving ways. These quiet strategies were the backbone of an empire's ability to communicate swiftly across continents. The Mongol postal workers' food habits offer a window into a world where endurance and adaptation were survival's quiet allies. Their diet, born of necessity and shaped by the demands of a mobile empire, reveals how even the smallest details, what a rider ate on the road, could influence history. The legacy of these foodways can still be seen today in the cuisines of Central Asia, where dried meats, fermented dairy, and simple broths remain staples. But beyond culture, these provisions were crucial links in a vast network that enabled the Mongol Empire to function as one of history's fastest and most expansive communication systems. Understanding these mundane details deepens our appreciation for how empires are not just forged by battles or kings, but by the everyday choices of people surviving in the margins, horse riders, cooks, and clerks who carried messages, meals, and history itself across the steppe. The final stretch, how the Mongol postal system shaped an empire's fate. The vast Mongol Empire, sprawling from the Pacific Ocean to the heart of Europe, was a marvel of logistics as much as military might. Behind its swift conquests and the rapid exchange of intelligence lay a largely overlooked but essential feature: the yam, the imperial postal system. And at the heart of this system were the postal workers, the riders and support staff, whose endurance and resourcefulness sustained the flow of messages that bound the empire together. In the early days of the empire's rapid expansion under Genghis Khan, the yam was a straightforward but ambitious idea, a network of relay stations spaced at regular intervals, where riders could swap exhausted horses for fresh ones, and where supplies, including food, awaited them. These stations were lifelines, but they were also fragile nodes in an enormous web. The sheer scale of the empire demanded continuous innovation and adaptation, particularly when it came to the food that fueled the riders on their relentless journeys. Food was not simply sustenance, it was strategy. The diet of the Mongol postal workers reflected the environment, the seasons, and the political realities of a sprawling empire that incorporated diverse cultures and climates. The staples, dried meats, fermented mares, milk, and simple broths, were chosen for their portability and caloric density. But as the empire grew, the yam system faced unprecedented logistical challenges that required new solutions and tested the limits of these humble provisions. As the Mongol Empire expanded, so did the complexity of sustaining its communication network. The yam system, initially designed for the relatively flat steppes of Mongolia, now had to cover vast and varied terrains: mountains, deserts, forests, and distant cities with climates that often contrasted sharply with the riders' homelands. This geographic diversity brought with it significant challenges in maintaining a consistent food supply for postal workers. In the arid deserts of Central Asia, for example, the availability of fresh water and pasture for horses was scarce. The dried meats and fermented dairy products that had served the riders well in the grasslands were often harder to come by. The riders adapted by incorporating local foods when possible, such as dried fruits and nuts, which provided essential vitamins and sugars needed for energy. Mountainous regions posed different problems. The cold and thin air drained energy faster, and the riders required richer, warmer meals to sustain themselves. Broths made from mutton and wild herbs became essential in these parts, along with hot fermented milk that provided both nutrition and a comforting warmth. Yet despite these adaptations, the postal workers often faced shortages, especially during winter months when the yam stations were harder to resupply. Political factors also influenced the supply chain. The empire's vastness meant that some relay stations were located in politically sensitive or recently conquered regions where local populations were not always cooperative. In such places, procuring food and maintaining stable supplies was a constant challenge. Riders sometimes had to carry extra rations for these stretches, knowing that the usual replenishment points might fail them. Behind every successful message delivery was the extraordinary endurance of the Mongol postal workers themselves. These men and women were more than mere couriers. They were the unseen backbone of an empire, tasked with navigating hostile terrains, unpredictable weather, and the constant pressure of tight deadlines. Their food habits and survival tactics were a crucial part of this endurance. Unlike the romanticized image of a lone horseman galloping across the steppe, the reality was far more grueling. Riders traveled in stages, often covering 100 to 200 miles a day by switching horses, but still pushing their physical limits. They had to eat quickly, rest briefly, and prepare for the next leg of their journey, all while ensuring the security of the messages they carried. Meals were often consumed on the move. Strips of dried meat, small balls of dried sour milk, called kurut, and sips of fermented mare's milk provided rapid energy. These foods were not only lightweight, but also packed with nutrients and electrolytes necessary to prevent dehydration and fatigue. The support staff at the relay stations, including cooks, stable hands, and horse trainers, played an equally vital role. They maintained the horses' health, prepared food, and ensured the stations operated smoothly. Many of these workers lived in remote locations, their lives marked by quiet diligence rather than glory. Their contribution to the empire's communication network was indispensable, yet rarely recorded in historical accounts. The efficient Mongol postal system was more than a logistical achievement. It was a force that helped shape political power and cultural exchange across Eurasia. The ability to communicate swiftly across thousands of miles allowed Genghis Khan and his successors to coordinate military campaigns, govern distant territories, and maintain control over a vast and diverse population. Messages carrying orders, intelligence, and diplomatic correspondence traveled faster than ever before, often outpacing the movements of armies themselves. This rapid communication enabled quick responses to rebellions, strategic redeployments, and the spread of laws and decrees that unified the empire under a common code. But beyond politics and military might, the yam facilitated the exchange of ideas, technologies, and goods. Along the routes, merchants, travelers, and envoys took advantage of the relay stations, turning the postal system into arteries of cultural diffusion. The foods and dietary practices of the postal workers also reflected this blending of cultures, as ingredients and cooking methods from various regions were incorporated into their meals. This interconnectedness laid groundwork for what historians now call the Pax Mongolica, a period of relative peace that fostered trade and cultural exchange along the Silk Road. The humble foodways of postal workers were a small but essential part of this larger historical tapestry, illustrating how ordinary survival strategies supported extraordinary historical developments. The forgotten art of the Ottoman scribal schools. How ordinary clerks shaped an empire. In the sprawling expanse of the Ottoman Empire, where minarets pierced the sky and bustling bazaars overflowed with spices and silks, a quieter but no less vital world existed behind closed doors. The world of the scribal schools, or mektebs, where ordinary clerks learned the painstaking art of record keeping. Though seemingly mundane, these scribes were the invisible gears turning the wheels of empire, their work vital for administration, justice, and communication across vast territories. The Ottoman scribal tradition dated back centuries, rooted in earlier Islamic administrative practices, yet it evolved uniquely to meet the demands of a sprawling, multi-ethnic empire. In cities like Istanbul, Edirne, and Bursa, mektebs taught boys from various social backgrounds how to wield pen and ink with precision, mastering calligraphy, accounting, and legal terminology. The curriculum was demanding and disciplined, emphasizing patience and attention to detail. Students learned to copy documents accurately, maintain ledgers of tax collection, draft legal petitions, and prepare correspondence for provincial governors. These seemingly tedious tasks were essential for ensuring the empire's smooth functioning, from collecting revenues to adjudicating disputes. The life of a student in an Ottoman scribal school was both structured and rigorous. Days began early, often before dawn, with recitations of the Quran, since religious instruction was inseparable from literacy and learning. This spiritual foundation underscored the scribe's role, not merely clerks, but custodians of the empire's legal and moral order. After morning prayers, students would settle in at low desks, their reed pens poised over parchment or paper, made from linen or hemp. Ink, typically a deep black made from soot and gum Arabic, was carefully prepared to ensure it flowed smoothly and lasted long. Each letter was crafted with deliberate care, calligraphy being an art that conveyed both clarity and beauty. Lessons involved copying official documents, such as tax records or imperial decrees, word for word. Mistakes were not tolerated. A single miswritten numeral could mean the loss of revenue or the miscarriage of justice. Teachers, often veteran scribes themselves, scrutinized every page, providing corrections and guidance with patience and precision. The curriculum also included training in divan, court, terminology, Ottoman Turkish, Arabic, and sometimes Persian, the administrative languages of the empire. This multilingual education prepared scribes to communicate across the empire's diverse population, which included Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, and many others. Outside the classroom, the world of the scribes was one of quiet service and careful diligence. Most of these clerks came from modest backgrounds, sons of artisans, merchants, or small farmers who sought a path into the imperial bureaucracy. For many, success in the scribal schools was a stepping stone to stable government employment, offering a life removed from the uncertainties of rural labor or trade. Upon graduation, scribes might be assigned to provincial offices, courts, or tax collection departments, where their painstaking record-keeping underpinned the empire's governance. They drafted reports, maintained ledgers, and recorded court proceedings, often working long hours in dimly lit chambers. Their influence, though rarely visible, was significant. Accurate records ensured the fair collection of taxes, the proper distribution of land grants, and the resolution of legal disputes. Through their work, they linked distant provinces to the imperial center, enabling the Ottoman state to function cohesively despite its vast geography and ethnic complexity. Yet, despite their importance, scribes lived in relative obscurity. Their names rarely appear in historical narratives, overshadowed by sultans and generals. Still, their contributions were vital, and the meticulous education they received in mektebs was the foundation of an empire's enduring stability. The scribal schools themselves were often modest institutions, sometimes attached to mosques or madrasas, other times operating independently. Their physical spaces reflected the practical nature of their work. Simple rooms furnished with low tables, shelves filled with scrolls and ledgers, and occasionally a small library of reference texts. Despite their unassuming appearance, these schools were centers of quiet intellectual activity. Students engaged not only with rote copying, but also with discussions about legal principles, administrative reforms, and the ethical responsibilities of their profession. Their instructors, who were frequently experienced bureaucrats, instilled a sense of duty and integrity that transcended mere clerical work. An interesting aspect of the Ottoman scribal tradition was the careful development of specialized scripts. Calligraphy was not only a practical skill, but also a refined art form. Scripts such as Naskh and Thuluth were mastered not only for their legibility, but for their aesthetic qualities, making official documents not just records, but objects of beauty and respect. The importance placed on calligraphy also reflected a broader Ottoman respect for written words as conveyors of authority and legitimacy. The Sultan's decrees, religious texts, and legal codes were all beautifully rendered, signaling their significance and encouraging careful adherence. As the scribes progressed through their training, they gradually took on greater responsibilities, preparing to enter a bureaucratic system that was both complex and hierarchical. The Ottoman administration was divided into numerous departments, each with its own specialized clerks and record keepers. These included the Divan, Imperial Council, the Defterdalik, Finance Department, and provincial offices spread across the empire's far-flung territories. Each position required different skills and expertise. For example, those assigned to the tax offices had to be adept at arithmetic and land surveying, while court scribes needed a deep understanding of legal formulas and judicial protocols. Throughout, accuracy remained paramount. Errors could mean financial loss for the empire or injustice for its subjects. Beyond technical skill, Ottoman scribes had to navigate a delicate social landscape. They worked alongside military officials, religious authorities, and local elites, often mediating between competing interests. Their records were sometimes contested, and their integrity could be tested by bribery or political pressure. Yet, many scribes prided themselves on their impartiality and dedication to truth. Ultimately, the scribal schools forged a core of disciplined, educated men who formed the administrative backbone of the Ottoman Empire. Through their quiet efforts, they maintained the machinery of governance, enabling the empire to endure for centuries. Their legacy, though unsung, is etched into the countless documents and archives that still survive, revealing the ordinary yet essential work that shaped a civilization. Inside the Ottoman bureaucracy, the daily lives and survival of imperial clerks. The transition from student to full-fledged scribe was not merely a matter of mastering penmanship and terminology. It was an immersion into the intricate and often demanding life of the Ottoman bureaucracy. For the clerks, survival involved more than just skill. It required navigating social hierarchies, managing daily routines under pressure, and balancing the demands of an empire stretching from the Mediterranean to the edges of the Middle East and North Africa. Workdays were long and regimented. In the dim light of oil lamps or natural daylight filtering through latticed windows, clerks sat hunched over desks, surrounded by piles of parchments, ink pots, and carefully stacked ledgers. Their tasks ranged from recording tax payments to drafting legal documents, often under tight deadlines set by provincial governors or the central government in Istanbul. The rhythm of their work was punctuated by the practical necessities of daily life. Meals were often quick and simple. Flatbreads dipped in olive oil, small servings of cheese or olives, and strong black tea to maintain alertness. Fresh foods were a luxury, especially in provincial outposts where supply chains were unreliable. To keep energy levels stable, scribes frequently consumed dried fruits and nuts, foods that could be stored easily and eaten between tasks. The clerk's social environment within the bureaucracy was a world of subtle negotiations and hierarchies. Although they occupied lower ranks compared to military officers and religious leaders, scribes wielded quiet influence through their control of information and records. Their daily interactions involved delicate diplomacy, balancing the expectations of superiors, the demands of local officials, and the occasional interference of merchants or litigants seeking favors. Many clerks developed intricate networks of patronage to advance their careers or secure protection. This meant that a successful scribe was not only meticulous in their work, but also adept at social navigation. Letters of recommendation, favors, and personal relationships could mean the difference between steady employment and dismissal. Yet despite these challenges, clerks shared a strong sense of professional identity. They took pride in their craftsmanship, the art of clear handwriting, precise accounting, and legal exactitude. This was a form of silent resistance against the chaotic realities of empire, where maintaining order and record was a tangible way to uphold justice and governance. Living conditions varied widely. In the imperial capital, scribes might enjoy modest accommodations near administrative centers, with access to libraries and religious schools. In contrast, provincial clerks often lived in simple quarters attached to government offices, facing isolation and limited resources. Nonetheless, their work connected them to the broader imperial project, a chain of communication and control stretching across continents. For many Ottoman clerks, the tools of their trade were both practical instruments and objects of deep personal significance. Reed pens, kalem, were carefully cut and sharpened with knives known as kalamtarash, and each clerk often carried his own pen case, ink pot, and small sharpening stone. These items were symbols of both identity and craft, and skilled scribes took great pride in maintaining them. The act of writing was slow and methodical. Unlike modern shorthand or typing, every line had to be legible, balanced, and, when required, artistically pleasing. Scribes were often judged by the beauty and clarity of their handwriting, especially when drafting imperial decrees or court records. Aesthetics and legibility were intertwined, not only because they conveyed authority, but because errors could have consequences for taxation, land ownership, or justice. Errors were handled seriously. In the empire's central offices, corrections were made using a careful strike-through, accompanied by a notation and a seal verifying the revision's authenticity. In more serious cases, entire pages were recopied. Wasting paper or parchment was discouraged, and skilled scribes knew how to balance efficiency with perfection. Despite the rigors of the job, the scribes occasionally found quiet joy in their routines. Poetry and riddles were sometimes scribbled into the margins of ledgers, a small indulgence in otherwise rigid documents. In larger cities, scribes gathered in coffee houses after work, discussing theology, law, and poetry, offering each other both intellectual companionship and practical advice. For many Ottoman clerks, the tools of their trade were both practical instruments and objects of deep personal significance. Reed pens, kalem, were carefully cut and sharpened with knives known as kalamtarash, and each clerk often carried his own pen case, ink pot, and small sharpening stone. These items were symbols of both identity and craft, and skilled scribes took great pride in maintaining them. The act of writing was slow and methodical. Unlike modern shorthand or typing, every line had to be legible, balanced, and, when required, artistically pleasing. Scribes were often judged by the beauty and clarity of their handwriting, especially when drafting imperial decrees or court records. Aesthetics and legibility were intertwined, not only because they conveyed authority, but because errors could have consequences for taxation, land ownership, or justice. Errors were handled seriously. In the empire's central offices, corrections were made using a careful strike-through, accompanied by a notation and a seal verifying the revision's authenticity. In more serious cases, entire pages were recopied. Wasting paper or parchment was discouraged, and skilled scribes knew how to balance efficiency with perfection. Despite the rigors of the job, The scribes occasionally found quiet joy in their routines. Poetry and riddles were sometimes scribbled into the margins of ledgers, a small indulgence in otherwise rigid documents. In larger cities, scribes gathered in coffee houses after work, discussing theology, law, and poetry, offering each other both intellectual companionship and practical advice, while often relegated to the shadows of military exploits or palace intrigues. The Ottoman clerks were, in many ways, the lifeblood of the empire's longevity. Their influence was felt not in loud proclamations, but in the quiet certainty that every court decision, land grant, or tax decree had been written down, double-checked, and filed away for reference. This system of documentation was especially vital during transitions of power or periods of crisis. When a sultan died or a rebellion stirred in the provinces, it was the records, land registers, tax logs, and military orders that ensured continuity. Bureaucracy was the glue that held a sprawling, multi-ethnic empire together, and the clerks were its caretakers. That said, survival within this system wasn't always guaranteed. Political upheavals, court purges, or accusations of incompetence could end a scribe's career. Occasionally, entire offices were disbanded, especially during budget cuts or administrative overhauls. To hedge against this instability, some scribes quietly maintained alternate careers, tutoring the sons of merchants, copying manuscripts for private collectors, or transcribing religious texts for local mosques. Others sought security through association with powerful patrons. In a few cases, scribes even rose beyond the bureaucracy to become judges, advisors, or diplomats, leveraging their mastery of language and law to attain higher office. But such paths were rare and often fraught with risk. Still, most clerks chose a quieter life, methodical, respectful, and deeply rooted in duty. They drank their coffee slowly, copied carefully, and went home to modest quarters where they would light a candle, say a quiet prayer, and prepare for another day of recording the empire's endless hum of administration. They left behind few monuments or grand declarations. Instead, their legacy lies in the neat lines of Ottoman Turkish inked into parchment, the history of empire, written one line at a time. The legacy of ink, how Ottoman scribes preserved empire in the margins. It is easy, when thinking about empires, to picture marble courts, bejeweled sultans, and armies sweeping across deserts and mountain passes. But the true machinery of imperial endurance often moved silently through corridors lined with scrolls, among desks covered in neat piles of parchment and ink. In these quiet corners worked the clerks, men whose tools were pens rather than swords, whose authority came not from command but from clarity, accuracy, and memory. In the final analysis, the scribes of the Ottoman Empire did not merely record history, they made it. Each name logged into a tax register, each border described in a land survey, each dispute resolved with a court summary. All were acts of preservation and of quiet power. The bureaucratic records they produced became a kind of scaffolding, supporting the architecture of governance long after the ink dried. But what became of the men behind the records? What happens when an empire no longer needs their services? As the Ottoman Empire moved into the 18th and 19th centuries, the role of the clerk began to shift, not just in name or structure, but in spirit. The world was changing around them. European powers expanded their diplomatic and colonial reach, and the empire's own elites began borrowing and reforming administrative tools to keep pace. Printing presses appeared, foreign advisors were summoned, and the language of reform, Tanzimat, echoed through the marble halls of Istanbul. Clerks who had once wielded their reed pens with centuries of tradition behind them now found themselves faced with new forms, new departments, and new styles of writing entirely. Handwritten registers were still vital, but mechanical duplication and later typewriters threatened to render their elegant calligraphy obsolete. Some adapted. These scribes embraced the reforms, learned foreign languages, and transitioned into the new ministries created by the Tanzimat reforms: the Ministry of Finance, the Ministry of Justice, the Foreign Affairs Office. Others resisted, quietly maintaining the old forms, whispering warnings that too much change would shatter the delicate order built over generations. For these men, the old records were not just ink and paper. They were a map of civilization. You could still find them in dusty corners of provincial offices. Elderly men with ink-stained fingers and furrowed brows, slowly copying an 18th century land title to satisfy a court inquiry, their script curved like the domes of the mosques that framed the skyline, their memory reaching back to a world before railroads, before telegraphs, before telegrams in French. In some quarters, the reforms brought confusion, even fear, that clerks after all, had once been the interpreters of imperial law and custom. Their knowledge was not only linguistic, but social, moral, even theological. But now, foreign systems of measurement, European-style law codes, and new financial techniques were taking hold. To many old scribes, it was as if a language they had spent a lifetime mastering was slowly being erased. Some adapted through necessity. A clerk in Aleppo might learn basic French phrases to correspond with a visiting Belgian advisor. Another in Skopje might take night lessons in arithmetic to serve in the expanding treasury office. But this was not the quiet, contemplative work their predecessors had known. It was rushed, urgent, often politically charged. Accuracy still mattered, but so did alignment with the latest minister's preferences, or the favor of a European-trained inspector. Others, especially in the provinces, clung to their roles in the Qada courts, the local Islamic tribunals. Here, the rhythms of the past lingered longer. Disputes over farmland, water rights, or family inheritance still required careful documentation. The scripts remained elegant. The paper, though thinner and sometimes recycled, was still treated with respect, and the scribes still sat cross-legged, with ink pots beside them, quietly preserving continuity amid the currents of change. Occasionally, a young student would wander into one of these old offices, fresh from a government school, carrying French notebooks and a metal-nibbed pen. The elders would nod politely, offer tea, and then, without a word, show the student how to draw a perfect diacritical dot in black ink. That tiny gesture held centuries of memory. By the dawn of the 20th century, the empire's administrators no longer relied solely on scribes. Telegraph wires ran across Anatolia and the Balkans. Government decrees could be transmitted in minutes rather than carried on horseback. Typewritten memos replaced scrolls. Printed forms replaced ledgers. The clerk's elegant calligraphy, once a sign of state authority, was now sometimes seen as an obstacle. Beautiful, but slow, outdated, even unreadable to the younger generation of officials educated in new state schools. Still, many clerks remained. Their names appeared in the lower corners of bureaucratic documents. Final proofreaders, annotators of record, keepers of archival consistency. Their skills in cross-referencing old documents, in understanding obscure land grants from 2 centuries earlier, or in interpreting the margins of tax registers, these were still vital in certain cases, particularly when land ownership or title disputes arose. In provinces where reforms were slow to reach, they served as walking encyclopedias of precedent. The clerks often lived in a kind of quiet anachronism. They drank their tea from saucers, wore woolen vests in the winter, and walked to work carrying folded newspaper clippings and battered ink kits. Some had children who had joined the modern ministries, engineers, telegraph operators, even foreign service officers, but the fathers still showed up at their dusty wooden desks, continuing to copy, annotate, and file, just as they always had. In cities like Damascus, Edirne, and Konya, you might find one such scribe, half retired, sitting in the corner of a court building, consulted once a week by a junior official trying to decipher an 1857 endowment document. "Ah, yes," the old clerk would mutter, adjusting his spectacles. "That land was once Vakuf, but not anymore. Here, I'll show you," would reach into an old file, and for a brief moment, the past would rise from the pages like steam from a kettle. Rice, rest, and registry. Inside the forgotten inns of imperial China. The road to shelter. Life along the empire's way stations. Before the sun had fully climbed over the tiled roofs and terraced hillsides of the Tang dynasty, the roads of the empire had already begun to stir. Hooves pressed softly into dust. Lacquered carts creaked under the weight of scrolls, tribute, and grain, and sandals shuffled across stones smoothed by centuries of footsteps. Among the empire's travelers were monks heading west, grain collectors moving east, and government runners dispatched with ink-stained messages strapped to their belts. All of them, no matter their rank or mission, shared one common dependency: the humble state-run inn known as the Yai or Yijan. These inns were not places of luxury, nor were they open to the general public. They were government establishments, distributed along imperial roads at regular intervals, serving a highly practical function. They gave shelter to those on official business: scribes, inspectors, soldiers, tax collectors, and imperial couriers, all moving according to a rhythm dictated by administration rather than comfort. The guests were issued meals, basic bedding, and, if necessary, replacement horses or porters. No money changed hands, but neither did any luxuries. The walls were bare, the rooms cold in winter, and the food often just enough to fill a traveller's belly before dawn summoned the next leg of their journey. Yet these way stations, scattered across plains, hills, forests and riverbanks, formed a quiet lifeline for the empire. Without them, communication broke down. Without them, even the emperor's voice could not travel beyond the capital. Most Yizhan followed a predictable structure. The outer gate opened into a stone courtyard, flanked by low buildings, storage, animal stables, sometimes a grain shed. The inn proper was not unlike a rural magistrate's office. Thick wooden beams, tiled roofs, and narrow windows to hold in heat during the colder months. Inside, the lodging space was typically divided into rank-based quarters. A minor tax official might sleep on a straw mat beside a stone brazier, while a higher-ranking envoy might receive a small room with a curtained window and slightly finer tea. And always, there was the record book. Upon arrival, the head clerk of the inn, often a local man who had served in the post for decades, would dip his brush into the inkstone and write the date, the name of the traveller, their origin, destination, purpose of travel, and what provisions were issued. Each entry was neat and orderly, in the vertical hand of the classical Chinese bureaucratic style. The log was reviewed monthly by regional officials and submitted upward in reports to the central administration. No matter how small or remote, each inn was part of the grand mechanism of governance. Whether you were traveling from Chang'an to Luoyang or through the humid jungles of southern Yunnan, your presence was noted, and your body, for a short time, was carried by the state. The food offered at the inns varied by region, but it was always sparse and strictly rationed. A bowl of thin rice porridge, perhaps accompanied by a salted vegetable, a piece of dried tofu, or, if you were lucky, a boiled egg. Meat was rare and reserved for high-ranking officials. Still, after a long day on the road, such meals were often eaten with quiet gratitude, the flavors absorbed more from hunger than spice. One of the more intriguing aspects of these way stations was their role as microcosms of imperial order and surveillance. The inns were staffed by clerks who, much like their counterparts in the Ottoman Empire, kept detailed registers not only of travelers, but of the goods they transported and the horses they used. The scribes' ink-stained hands recorded everything, from official documents and courier deliveries to the number of grain sacks and livestock passing through. In some instances, these clerks doubled as informal informants. The state relied heavily on their reports to monitor local conditions, unrest, and possible corruption along the routes. Travelers were asked questions. Where had they come from? Who did they meet? What had they seen? Answers were recorded, with measured impartiality, but served the broader network of imperial intelligence. The inns also provided a logistical backbone for the empire's famed courier system, known as the Yizhan Postal Network. Mounted riders carrying sealed messages could rely on fresh horses and timely shelter. The speed and reliability of communication along these routes were crucial in coordinating tax collection, troop movements, and imperial decrees. Beyond the functional, these inns were modest social hubs. They saw the mingling of officials from distant provinces, merchants with goods in transit, and occasionally pilgrims making their spiritual journeys. Around the evening fires, stories might be exchanged, whispered tales of bandits, rumors from the capital, or the quiet suffering of peasants hit by poor harvests. Though few left written records of these exchanges, the inns were silent witnesses to the daily lives and trials of the empire's undercurrent. As night settled over the inn's tiled roofs, the sounds softened to a quiet hum, the low murmur of distant voices, the rustle of bamboo blinds, and the occasional clatter of a stable door closing. Outside, the road stretched into darkness, winding its way through hills and fields, sometimes disappearing behind mist-shrouded mountains. For many travelers, these inns were the only place between the relentless march of their journey and a momentary refuge. The empire's roads and inns, though often overlooked in the grand sweep of history, were the veins through which life flowed. They sustained the communication, control, and cohesion of one of the world's largest pre-modern states. While emperors issued edicts and generals marshaled armies, it was these humble way stations that ensured those orders reached even the farthest village, and that the empire's fragile administrative machinery kept moving. Yet these inns were more than just utilitarian stops. They were spaces where the human element of governance quietly unfolded, where exhaustion met hospitality, where bureaucracy intersected with kindness, and where the empire's vastness was made tangible in the simple act of offering a bowl of porridge and a straw mattress. As dawn approached, new travelers would arrive. The ink-stained clerks would ready their brushes, and the eternal cycle of roads and rest would continue, a testament to the mundane yet indispensable rhythms that held an empire together. The keepers of the road, lives behind the imperial inns. The day at an imperial yizhan often began before dawn. While the roads outside still lay in darkness, the inn's caretakers stirred, lighting braziers to push back the chill and preparing the sparse morning meal. Typically a thin porridge, sometimes with pickled vegetables or dried beans. These keepers were a mix of local laborers, retired officials, and occasionally soldiers reassigned to manage the logistical side of the empire's communication network. Their tasks were both simple and essential, maintaining the buildings, caring for the horses and pack animals, preparing lodgings for the next wave of travelers, and updating the official registers. The latter was a task requiring literacy and precision, as errors in record keeping could delay deliveries, cause disputes over resources, or even lead to punishments for negligent clerks. Despite the simplicity of their duties, the keepers worked within the larger machinery of imperial control. Their eyes and ears were the frontline observers of the empire's fringes, reporting on local conditions, weather, and unusual events. In times of unrest or famine, their notes sometimes provided the only early warning to distant officials. The keepers' lives were marked by routines dictated by the passage of travelers and seasons. Winter brought challenges, cold rooms, frozen water supplies, and difficulties in sourcing fresh food. Summer meant long days under the sun, tending to exhausted horses and ensuring travelers were fed and sheltered despite shortages. While their role was unglamorous, the keepers maintained a delicate balance between hospitality and regulation. They could not openly offer comfort or luxuries beyond the strict norms of state provisioning, yet many found ways to ease the journey. An extra bowl of rice, a warm blanket, a kind word. These small acts of kindness, though undocumented, became the quiet threads of human connection binding the empire together. The keepers of the Yizhan were often recruited locally, their intimate knowledge of the region's terrain and weather, patterns invaluable for managing provisions and anticipating the needs of travelers. Many were former soldiers or minor officials who found themselves stationed far from the bustling capitals, living lives marked by isolation and repetitive tasks. In these quiet posts, they performed duties that were as much about maintaining order as about survival. Inns sometimes doubled as makeshift courts or dispute resolution centers. When travelers quarreled over routes or goods, local villagers might bring complaints to the clerks, turning these inns into small hubs of governance. The challenges were numerous. During periods of drought or war, food stocks dwindled, and keepers had to ration carefully to avoid famine among travelers and animals alike. Sometimes bandits or rebels attacked the inns, testing the mettle of those who guarded them. The keepers, often armed only with farming tools or staffs, relied on quick thinking and local alliances to protect their charges. With the transition from the Tang to the Song dynasty, the imperial postal system expanded and became more structured. Inns were standardized in layout, provisioning, and record keeping, reflecting the Song rulers' emphasis on bureaucratic efficiency. Innovations such as early paper money and printed courier permits emerged, linking the inns more tightly into the empire's economic and administrative networks. Despite this increased formalization, the core human story remained. The keepers' diaries, rare but invaluable sources, reveal moments of humor, fatigue, and even compassion. A clerk might note the unexpected generosity of a traveling monk who shared his meager rations, or the heartbreaking departure of a soldier wounded on campaign. These inns, in their quiet perseverance, encapsulate the daily grind behind the empire's grandeur, a reminder that vast historical forces rest on the shoulders of ordinary people, tending fires and recording names in dusty ledgers. Though the inns were designed as practical spaces, they often became transient communities. Travelers from distant provinces, each bearing different dialects and customs, met briefly within these walls. Conversations were terse, often conducted through gestures or the universal language of weariness and gratitude. At times, a merchant caravan would arrive, its drivers eager for rest and the chance to repair carts or tend to injured animals. Occasionally, a government courier exhausted from a long stretch would collapse onto a simple mat, clutching sealed messages vital to imperial administration. These inns witnessed a slow but constant rotation of humanity. Officials, traders, soldiers, pilgrims, and even entertainers passing through on circuit. One keeper's journal from the early Song dynasty, preserved in a provincial archive, tells of a memorable summer when a troupe of traveling musicians sought shelter. The players, presence briefly lifted the heavy silence of the inn, their music drifting softly into the night. For the briefest moment, the keepers and travelers alike were reminded of life beyond the road's hardships. The system was not without its flaws. The central government's demands for efficiency sometimes strained local resources. Overworked, clerks faced pressure to expedite travelers and reports, and corruption occasionally crept in. Bribes for better rooms, falsified records to mask shortages. Imperial inspectors were periodically dispatched to root out such abuses, but given the distances involved, oversight was often inconsistent. Moreover, as the empire grew and political turmoil flared in some regions, certain routes fell into disrepair. Roads became muddy quagmires in the rainy season, bridges rotted, inns closed or operated with reduced staff. Travelers learned to navigate these challenges, sometimes altering their journeys or relying on informal networks of hospitality. Yet, despite these difficulties, the Yizhan system endured. It adapted to dynastic changes, economic shifts, and the ebb and flow of imperial power. The inns stood as quiet witnesses to history's march, humble shelters where countless individuals found rest, where bureaucratic order met the unpredictability of human life. The quiet guardians, the role of medieval monastic librarians in preserving knowledge. When you think of medieval monasteries, the grand cathedrals, chanting monks, or the flickering candlelight might come to mind. Yet, behind these sacred walls, another quiet, often overlooked group of individuals worked tirelessly to preserve the intellectual heritage of the ancient world and lay the groundwork for the Renaissance. These were the monastic librarians, the guardians of knowledge during an era often misunderstood as the Dark Ages. Their daily lives were far from the dramatic battles or royal intrigues that populate history books. Instead, they were filled with painstakingly copying manuscripts by hand, organizing scrolls and codices, and creating catalogues to keep order in the growing collections. In dimly lit scriptoria, these scribes labored for hours, their quills scratching on parchment as they worked to preserve classical literature, religious texts, scientific treatises, and philosophical works. This story takes you into the world of these silent custodians, revealing the mundane yet critical routines that ensured knowledge survived through centuries of turmoil. You'll discover the challenges they faced, from limited resources and fragile materials to the threat of invasions and fires, and the surprising ingenuity they employed to protect their treasures. As we begin, imagine the scent of old parchment, the faint rustle of pages turning, and the methodical rhythm of copying that echoed through stone cloisters. These sounds marked a beacon of continuity in a turbulent world, where every letter copied could mean the difference between loss and preservation. But how did these monasteries, often isolated and remote, become the central repositories of knowledge? And what methods did these librarians use to keep their collections organized and accessible in an age before the printing press? These questions guide us into a deeper understanding of the vital role monastic librarians played, a role that history has often underestimated. As we move deeper into the life of medieval monastic librarians, it's important to imagine the rhythm of their daily routines within the cloistered walls of monasteries scattered across Europe. Far from the bustling cities, these religious communities often existed in relative isolation, their libraries tucked away in quiet corners of stone buildings, shielded from the chaos outside. Daily rituals in the library. Each day began early, often before dawn. Monastic librarians awoke to the soft tolling of bells, signaling not just prayer times, but also moments to tend to their custodial duties. After morning prayers, a librarian's work would typically start in the scriptorium, a dedicated room where manuscripts were copied, repaired, or illuminated with intricate decorations. The scribes and librarians handled fragile parchment or vellum sheets with meticulous care. They cleaned, trimmed, and sometimes scraped old manuscripts to reuse materials in a process known as palimpsesting. Their quills were sharpened, ink prepared from oak galls and iron salts, and rulers used to create precise lines for writing. Throughout the day, librarians maintained catalogues, handwritten registers listing the titles and locations of manuscripts. These catalogues were critical for scholars or monks seeking texts, ensuring that knowledge was not lost amid the growing collections, preserving knowledge against time and threats. One of the most daunting challenges was the fragility of the materials. Parchment was susceptible to moisture, mold, and wear. Librarians had to constantly monitor storage conditions, often using wooden shelves with open slats for airflow. The threat of fire was constant, as candles were the primary source of light. And many monasteries experienced devastating library fires that destroyed invaluable works. Beyond natural decay, human threats loomed large. Invasions by Vikings or local wars could lead to libraries being ransacked or burned. Some monasteries were strategically located in remote areas to avoid such dangers. But this isolation also made acquiring new texts difficult. Despite these challenges, monastic librarians developed ingenious methods to protect their collections. They used protective wooden cases or wrapped manuscripts in cloth. In some cases, duplicate copies of important texts were sent to sister monasteries as a safeguard. The importance of networks and exchanges. While isolated, monasteries were not completely cut off. Monastic networks across Europe allowed for the exchange of manuscripts and knowledge. Couriers carried precious texts between abbeys, facilitating intellectual dialogue that transcended geographic barriers. These exchanges also helped standardize religious texts and promoted the spread of ideas such as early scientific knowledge and classical philosophy, preserved through the painstaking work of these librarians. A quiet legacy from scriptorium to Renaissance. As we approach the final part of this quiet yet enduring story, it's worth pausing to consider the larger impact these medieval monastic librarians had, not only on their time, but on the centuries that followed. While their lives were often cloistered and repetitive, their influence rippled through time, touching the Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and even our modern digital age. Seeds of the Renaissance. The very idea of a rebirth of classical learning in the Renaissance would not have been possible without the quiet diligence of monastic librarians. The classical texts of Greece and Rome The works of Aristotle, Cicero, Euclid, Galen, and Virgil had been carefully preserved, copied, and protected by monks who often had little context for the content they were reproducing. They may not have fully understood the philosophical arguments or mathematical proofs they transcribed, but their commitment to fidelity and preservation ensured that future scholars could study these works anew. The Renaissance humanists, who pored over ancient manuscripts with fresh eyes, found a trove of knowledge intact thanks to those long-forgotten monks. From handwritten to printed, the transition with the invention of the printing press in the mid-15th century, the laborious process of manuscript copying began to fade. But for several decades, printers relied heavily on monastic libraries to source the texts they wished to publish. Gutenberg's famous 42-line Bible, while revolutionary in form, still carried the aesthetic and structural DNA of the monks' scriptural texts. The layout, the chapters, even the illuminated initials. Monastic librarians played a key role during this transition. Many monasteries began to acquire printed books alongside their manuscript collections. Some monks even worked with printers, lending them manuscripts or helping edit texts for wider distribution. In this sense, the scribes did not simply vanish. They evolved. Their skills, developed in isolation and discipline, helped usher in a new era of information sharing, one that would forever change the world. Survivors of time. Libraries still standing. A number of monastic libraries remain today, their shelves still housing some of the volumes copied by hand centuries ago. The Biblioteca Malatestiana in Italy, the Abbey Library of St. Gall in Switzerland, and the Monastery of Montserrat in Spain are all living testaments to the monastic commitment to preservation. Walking through these ancient halls, one can still see the iron chains that once secured books to desks, the thick wooden covers of vellum-bound volumes, and even the faint margin notes of monks who couldn't help but comment, sometimes sharply, on the text they were copying. These libraries not only preserve physical artifacts, but also reflect the intellectual spirit of their creators. They are the whispers of a world that believed knowledge was sacred, worth defending against flame, sword, and the slow erosion of time. Final reflections. An enduring influence in an age of instant information and digital overload. It may seem difficult to appreciate the work of people who spent decades copying a single book, but their story is a reminder of the value of slow, patient work, of care, of faith, not just in religion, but in the future. They believed, perhaps without fully realizing it, that the words they preserved would matter someday. And they did. Without them, entire branches of human thought could have vanished, entire languages forgotten. The trajectory of science, philosophy, and literature dramatically altered, and yet they asked for no recognition. They wrote in silence, worked in shadows, and entrusted their legacy to generations they would never meet. So the next time you open a book, pause for a moment. Somewhere, long ago, a monk lit a candle, dipped his quill, and began to copy, for you, wool, weighing, and wharves, The quiet power of medieval English customs clerks, in which wool gets counted, seals get stamped, and a foggy river port, hums with quills and quiet determination. The year is 1322, and the River Thames rolls by, with the slow solemnity of a parchment unrolled at a clerk's table. The fog hangs over London's wharves, dampening sound and muting colour. The sort of morning that turns even the loudest hawker into a muffled silhouette. But for the customs clerks tucked into the customs house just off Billingsgate, the day's work has already begun. It is early, always early, for these scribes of sacks and scribes of silk, their fingers already smudged with ink and their noses close to vellum by the time most merchants have finished their breakfast ale. Customs. Clerks were not the heroes of war, nor the troubadours of legend. They were, in the parlance of modern bureaucracy, the middle layer, not noble enough to escape tedium, not common enough to avoid blame, but in their hands flowed a power as significant as any sword or seal, the power of information. And in the England of the early 14th century, that meant one thing above all: wool. Wool was England's lifeblood. The cloth made from it clothed much of Europe and funded kings and castles, and at the heart of its movement were the humble customs clerks, perched at desks in half-lit halls, tasked with counting every sack, inspecting every bale, and ensuring that each fleece bore the king's rightful due. The customs house, a chamber of details. Let us step inside the customs house, just east of the Tower of London. The building is stout and timbered, its floor always slightly damp with river mist, its ceilings low and smoke-stained from the hearth in the rear. The smell of mildew, ink, and wool oil is strong, but no longer noticed by those who work there. The walls are lined with shelves, each one crammed with rolls of parchment tied with twine. The rolls are labelled in a clerk's hand, precise, black, and unwavering, despite the cheap ink and poor light. They bear titles like Cocket Rolls, Wool, Michaelmas to Hilary, 1321, and Mirage Levies, Bristol, Lent 1319. At the centre of the room are long oak tables, their surfaces scarred from decades of knife-cut quill sharpening and hot wax ceilings. Here sit the clerks, wearing robes of dull grey or brown, their hair cropped short, their eyes squinting as they scratch notes with care. Each morning, the day's ships are listed from port watches and messenger reports. The merchants arrive, sometimes bleary-eyed and bristling with protest, sometimes smooth-tongued and offering bribes wrapped in flattery or coin. But the customs clerk is not swayed, or rather, he is not supposed to be. Corruption exists, as it always does, but for many, the rules are not only sacred, they are the only source of personal power in a rigid, hierarchical world. A clerk like Thomas de Salt Fleetby, who came from a village near the Lincolnshire coast and rose to the London wool desk, knew the thrill of catching a dishonest exporter in a lie. He had memorized the markings on dozens of regional wool sacks, patterns of cords and seals that denoted not only quality but taxation category. He could recite from memory the correct dues for export via sea versus land, and he often scolded younger clerks who failed to cross-check ship manifests against the merchants' sworn declarations. Cockets, petty custom, and the language of trade wool wasn't simply thrown onto boats and waved goodbye. Exporting it required documentation, quite a bit of it in fact. This was where the cocket came in. An official document issued by customs clerks bearing a seal and signature, certifying that customs duties had been paid. Without a cocket, no legitimate trader could move goods out of the country. Some tried, of course, but the penalties were steep. Goods could be seized, licenses revoked, even jail imposed for the more flagrant offenders. There were also other levies to record. One was petty custom, a tax levied on alien, i.e., foreign merchants. This was tracked meticulously, often in Latin or French depending on the merchant's origin. Another was mirage, a toll collected for the repair of town walls, and pavage, for the upkeep of roads and bridges. All of these were entered with extraordinary care, not for any particular love of infrastructure, but because the customs house's rolls were checked regularly by royal agents, and at times even by the exchequer itself. Imagine the table before you. A clerk dips his quill in an iron gall ink pot and scratches a line in the daybook. He notes the name of the merchant, Giles at Wharf. Next, the number of sacks, 22, labelled with the double knot seal of Sussex fleece. Declared destination, Bruges. He enters the weight, the amount paid, the cocket number, and finally, the date and initials of the confirming officer. Later, that line will be duplicated in the port roll, and the cocket will be pressed with wax and filed. All this for wool. A day on the wharves out on the riverbank, workers unload carts of fleece, wrapped in coarse cloth and stitched closed with heavy thread. The air is heavy with lanolin and mud. Each bale is weighed on a large scale, overseen by the customs-appointed weighmaster, another figure whose job is often thankless but crucial. If the merchant protests the weight, and they often do, a second weighing is ordered, this time with extra witnesses, perhaps even a royal appointee if things get heated. The wharf masters and tidekeepers manage the flow of barges and note which vessels are being loaded. The clerks will refer to these notations later. If the merchant claims to have sent 20 sacks but the tidekeeper noted only 18 going aboard, there will be questions. Clerks often walk the wharves, not in robes now, but in sturdy cloaks and hoods, trying to keep ledgers dry as they double-check details. One such clerk, a woman named Isabel of Lambeth, has recently made waves in the customs office. Her writing is neater than most of her colleagues, and her calculations unfailingly correct. Though rare, women did appear in these roles occasionally, especially if widowed or from literate merchant families. She jots a note with gloved fingers. Discrepancy in seal number. Possibly reused cord from last season. It may be nothing. It may be fraud. It will be investigated. Not all ink in order. Of course, not everything ran smoothly. Records from the period mention entire rolls going missing, some likely stolen, others accidentally destroyed by fire or flood. London's Thames side was prone to both. There are accounts of clerks sleeping in the customs house to guard against thieves, or being scolded by superior officers for improperly stored cockets. At times, tension ran high between merchants and clerks. One chronicler noted a skirmish in 1317 where an angry wine importer threw a ledger into the river after being charged triple duty. Then there were the political storms. When King Edward II fell into disfavour, customs revenue often became entangled with baronial complaints. Local lords accused customs officials of overreach. Some clerks found themselves summoned to Parliament to explain discrepancies, or worse, summoned to court for accusations of corruption or negligence. Despite this, the work continued. Day in, day out. Ink was mixed. Quills were trimmed. Fleeces were counted. Errors were corrected. It was tedious work. It was vital work. Ending thought for Section 1. So much of the medieval economy, and indeed the royal treasury itself, depended not on knights or kings, but on the careful hands of clerks noting weights and collecting dues in damp little rooms on the Thames. But how did these customs records shape the decisions of monarchs, the fates of merchants, or the growth of England's trade empire? English customs clerks. This part will explore their record-keeping methods, relationships with merchants and smugglers, and how their work influenced medieval English trade. The hum of the waterfront was a steady backdrop to the customs clerks. Daily life. The docks never truly slept. Long before dawn, ships would begin their cautious maneuvering into harbour, their sails barely visible in the grey light of morning. The clerks, stationed at their posts within the customs houses, modest stone buildings positioned strategically near the wharves, were already at their desks, quills in hand, ready to capture the endless parade of goods passing through. England's gateways to the world. In this world of wool bales, barrels of wine, bolts of cloth, and crates of salted fish, the customs clerks stood as the invisible gatekeepers of the Crown's revenue. Their role was far more intricate than simply counting goods or collecting tolls. Every item recorded in their ledgers represented a small victory for royal authority, a testament to the meticulous bureaucracy that underpinned England's growing economic strength. Tools of the trade. Ledgers, scales, and seals. The clerk's essential tool was the ledger, a hefty leather-bound volume filled with neatly ruled pages, each one a battlefield of ink and precision. These ledgers were more than just records. They were the official proof of a transaction's legitimacy. The clerk's skill lay in the accuracy of these entries, which detailed the type of goods, quantities, the ship or merchant involved, and the fees levied. The process began when a ship docked and the goods were unloaded. The weighers, often working alongside the clerks, would use large steelyard balances to measure wool bales or barrels of wine. The weight was crucial. Customs duties were often calculated based on weight rather than volume or quantity. This requirement meant that clerks and weighers needed to be exact, for any discrepancy could lead to disputes, loss of revenue, or accusations of corruption. Once the weighing was complete, the clerk would assign the appropriate tariff, a task governed by complex and sometimes arcane royal statutes. These tariffs fluctuated according to the political winds of the time, rising during wartime to fund campaigns, falling during periods of trade alliance or royal favour. For the merchants, this unpredictability was a constant source of anxiety. For the clerks, It was a reminder of their role as enforcers of royal policy. To prevent fraud, clerks affixed wax seals to the recorded entries and sometimes to the goods themselves. These seals, often embossed with the royal coat of arms or the insignia of the customs house, served as physical guarantees that the goods had passed inspection and that the duties had been paid. Navigating the merchant relationship despite their official authority, customs clerks often walked a precarious line when dealing with merchants and ship captains. The merchants were powerful figures, controlling the flow of goods that sustained local economies and royal coffers alike. Many of them had long-standing relationships with the customs officials, some cordial, others strained. On busy days, clerks might find themselves negotiating directly with merchants seeking exemptions, reductions, or simply a faster release of their goods. The clerk's decisions could make or break a merchant's fortunes, and as such, they were sometimes the target of bribery or intimidation. Yet the clerks were not merely passive actors. Many of them cultivated networks of influence, leveraging their knowledge of trade patterns and political connections. Some rose through the ranks to positions of considerable power, overseeing entire regional customs districts or advising royal administrators. The shadow of smuggling was an ever-present threat in the port cities. Despite the clerks' vigilance, some goods slipped past the official channels, hidden beneath legitimate cargo, unloaded at night, or moved under false documentation. The customs clerks maintained a wary eye towards suspected smugglers, often working with port authorities and local law enforcement to curb these clandestine operations. Still, smuggling was so widespread that it became almost an accepted facet of maritime trade. This constant cat-and-mouse game shaped the clerks' procedures. They developed intricate methods of inspection and cross-checking, comparing the ship's manifest with the ledger entries, questioning suspicious discrepancies, and sometimes conducting surprise inspections. Ledger errors and historical consequences. Despite their best efforts, clerks were human, and errors in ledgers occasionally occurred. Sometimes these mistakes were minor, a misplaced digit, an incorrect weight, but other times they could have significant repercussions. A famous example from the early 15th century involved the customs house at Bristol, where a miscalculation of wool exports led to a temporary collapse in recorded revenues, prompting an investigation that uncovered systemic fraud by a network of corrupt weighers and clerks. Such incidents did not just impact the Crown's finances, they also influenced the evolution of trade regulations. Royal administrators used these failures as justification for reforming customs procedures, tightening oversight, and increasing penalties for fraud. The clerks' work, though often invisible to the wider world, was fundamental to England's economic stability. Their ledgers preserved the data historians now rely on to understand medieval trade flows, social networks, and economic policy. Section 3. The quiet power and lasting legacy of medieval English customs clerks. By the dawn of the 16th century, the role of customs clerks in medieval England had evolved far beyond the simple recording of wool weights or the counting of barrels. At bustling wharves, they had become central figures in the complex machinery of the English economy, guardians of royal revenue, and often unsung architects of state power. Their daily labor, measured in ledgers filled with meticulous entries, the clink of weights on ancient scales, and the whispered conversations by riverbanks and docks held a quiet power that shaped the course of English history in subtle but profound ways. The rising importance of customs administration. England's economy in the late medieval period was increasingly reliant on overseas trade, especially the export of wool, which was among the most valuable commodities of the time. The Crown's income depended heavily on duties levied on these goods, which meant that customs clerks were not merely clerks in the traditional sense. They were, in effect, fiscal agents for the kingdom. Their accuracy and vigilance ensured the Crown received its due, while also fostering an environment where trade could flourish with some measure of regulation and predictability. The transition toward a more centralized and professional customs administration began in earnest under Henry VII, who recognized that efficient revenue collection was vital to restoring royal authority after decades of civil strife. By instituting reforms that codified customs procedures and established permanent customs offices at major ports such as London, Southampton, and Bristol, Henry VII laid the groundwork for a modern system of trade oversight. The customs clerks were the linchpins of this system, trained not only to tally goods but to detect fraud, oversee inspections, and enforce tariffs. Day-to-day realities, the work behind the ledgers. Though their work might appear mundane at first glance, the lives of customs clerks were filled with nuanced challenges. Their responsibilities included verifying the weight and quality of wool bales, scrutinizing ship manifests, and inspecting goods for illegal smuggling. Many ports had their own idiosyncrasies, with different local customs and peculiar trade patterns that clerks had to understand intimately. Customs clerks operated within a delicate balance of authority and diplomacy. They needed to assert the Crown's interests without alienating merchants whose trade sustained the local economies. This required a mix of firm oversight, shrewd negotiation, and at times, patience with lengthy delays or disputes over duties. Their role demanded integrity, keen observation, and an ability to navigate the ever-shifting relationships between royal officials, merchants, ship captains, and local communities. In the medieval world, where paperwork was handwritten by candlelight and mistakes could cost the Crown hundreds of pounds, the clerk's precision was critical. Errors in record-keeping could result in significant revenue losses or disputes that slowed the movement of goods. Moreover, clerks often worked under the constant threat of bribery attempts or intimidation, requiring a steadfast commitment to duty. The human side of the clerks. Amid these duties, the clerks themselves were often figures of modest means and unassuming presence. Few left behind extensive personal records, but occasional surviving letters and accounts hint at the hardships they endured. Long hours, exposure to harsh weather on docks, and the social isolation of their often solitary offices. One surviving letter from a 15th century customs clerk in Bristol reveals his exhaustion during the wool export season, describing the relentless flow of goods and the pressure to balance speed with accuracy. Such glimpses into their daily experiences humanize these bureaucrats. reminding us that history is built on the quiet efforts of individuals far removed from the grand narratives of kings and battles. The wider impact on England's economy and governance. The customs clerk's work rippled far beyond the docks and counting houses. By ensuring that the Crown's revenues were reliably collected, they enabled monarchs to finance wars, build infrastructure, and support administration, critical components in the consolidation of English national power. Furthermore, their meticulous records created the first detailed economic data sets in England's history. These archives offer modern historians invaluable insights into trade volumes, commodity prices, and merchant networks. Through these ledgers, we glimpse the rise and fall of markets, the shifting importance of ports, and even the everyday goods that shaped the material culture of medieval England. In this way, customs clerks were unwitting chroniclers of history, their routine tasks contributing to the archival memory of a nation's economic life. Without their diligence, much of the empirical knowledge of medieval English trade would have been lost. Challenges and changes in the early modern period as England transitioned into the early modern era. The customs system and its clerks faced new challenges, increasing international competition, smuggling networks, and the complexities of colonial trade required ever more sophisticated bureaucratic responses. The growth of the English Navy and the expansion of overseas colonies in the 16th and 17th centuries further elevated the importance of customs revenue. Clerks were called upon to adapt to these changes, managing customs duties not only on wool, but on a growing variety of imports and exports, including spices, textiles, and precious metals. The professionalization of customs officials continued, and by the 18th century, customs clerks had evolved into part of a large, organized civil service that underpinned Britain's imperial ambitions. The quiet work of weighing, inspecting, and recording goods now served a global empire. Reflections, the quiet threads that bind history. Looking back, the story of the medieval English customs clerks is a testament to the power of seemingly small, methodical acts. While they may not appear in chronicles of kings or battles, their work was fundamental to the emergence of England as a commercial and political power. Their story reminds us that history is not only made by grand gestures, but also by routine, persistence, and careful record keeping. It is in the details, the weight of a wool bale, the crossing of a ledger entry, that the forces shaping nations quietly operate. So next time you consider the majesty of a medieval castle or the drama of a royal court, remember the customs, clerks, the patient, often invisible custodians of England's wealth and stability. Their legacy endures not only in dusty archives, but in the very foundations of modern economic and governmental systems.